Over the past decade, we have heard the same promises again and again. Emissions will peak by 2030, carbon neutrality by 2050, a global effort framed as a matter of humanity's future. But now it is 2026, and the world has clearly entered a very different phase. Economic growth is slowing. Debt levels are structurally high. Energy has been re-weaponized. And war, or preparation for war, has quietly returned to national budgets. This makes one question increasingly unavoidable. When the world is prioritizing recession, debt, and security, does carbon reduction still rank near the top of the agenda? Today's discussion is not about whether environmental protection is morally right, nor is it about whether climate change exists. I want to focus on one question only. Within today's real political and economic structures, what has actually happened to global carbon reduction? Let me state the core conclusion up front. This is the anchor of the entire episode. Global carbon reduction has not failed because of technology. It has failed because of political economy, specifically the question of who pays. And when societies enter a survival-first phase, long-term, global public goods like carbon reduction are inevitably pushed down the priority list. Part 1. A reality we must confront. Why carbon reduction targets are no longer achievable. Before going further, we need to face a harsh but increasingly certain reality based on current policy trajectories. Global carbon reduction targets, especially in democratic countries, are no longer realistically achievable. Let's ground the discussion in concrete numbers. To achieve global net zero emissions by 2050, scientific and intergovernmental assessments show that global greenhouse gas emissions must fall by roughly 45% below 2010 levels by 2030. What do the actual numbers tell us? In 2010, total global greenhouse gas emissions amounted to around 59 billion tons of CO equivalent, with CO itself around 30 to 32 billion tons. By 2019, total emissions remained near 59 billion tons COEQ, with CO around 45 billion tons. That means over a decade there was no substantial reduction in overall emissions. And in terms of CO alone, emissions stayed high or rose. There is still a huge gap to reach the 45% emissions reduction needed to achieve the 2030 target. This is not emotional pessimism. It is the result of structural constraints. 1. The time window has already been consumed. Carbon reduction is not a slogan. It is a deeply time-dependent engineering challenge. Targets like 2030, 2040, and 2050 imply something very specific: a complete restructuring of energy systems, transportation networks, industrial production, housing, agriculture, within a very short historical window. But reality operates on different clocks. Large-scale energy and grid infrastructure takes decades. Industrial system replacement takes generations. Social behavior changes move at the speed of political cycles. After more than a decade consumed by energy crises, economic downturns, and political disputes, even a sudden surge in political will today cannot reverse the physical constraints. This is not a question of intention. To limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, pathways indicate that emissions should fall roughly 45% below 2010 levels by 2030, effectively needing a drop from about 59 billion tons of greenhouse gases to roughly 30 billion tons or less. But in reality, emissions have not shown a sustained downward trend. Instead, co-emissions have hovered near record highs around 37 to 38 billion tons, even after pandemic-related fluctuations. That means the once narrow time window is rapidly closing or may already be exhausted. The pathway itself has already been locked. 2. Democratic politics and long-term enforcement are in structural tension. In democratic systems, there is an unavoidable contradiction. Policies that require decades of sustained enforcement across multiple administrations while imposing continuous costs on ordinary citizens are extremely difficult to maintain at full strength. The reasons are straightforward: election cycles, 4 to 5 years; climate targets, 20 to 30 years; policy costs, immediate, visible, politically attributable; policy benefits, future, uncertain, difficult to verify. What does this mean in practice? It means that governments that maintain aggressive carbon reduction policies are almost guaranteed to pay a political price in the present. And the next government needs only one sentence to soften those commitments. We need a more realistic approach. As a result, what we observe is not open rejection, but something far more common: slower timelines, adjusted pathways, redefined success metrics. 3. Fiscal reality has closed the door on radical paths. Now add one defining variable of our era: fiscal constraint. As debt servicing absorbs more budgetary space, as energy security and defense spending become non-negotiable priorities, carbon reduction is systematically reclassified as a deferrable objective. But in engineering terms, deferral often equals failure, because the total target does not shrink. Only the remaining time does. Mathematically, this implies an end-stage reduction slope so steep that it becomes socially and politically impossible. Therefore, we can state calmly and clearly, under combined time, institutional and fiscal constraints, the original version of global carbon reduction targets has already become unworkable in most countries. Part 2. The Paris Agreement. The problem is structural, not moral. With this context, we can now examine the Paris Agreement itself. Here is a critical observation. From the beginning, the Paris Agreement functioned more as a reputation system than as an execution system. Why? A true engineering plan requires 3 elements. 1. Binding. 2. Enforceable penalties. 3. A shared fiscal mechanism. The Paris framework, by contrast, relies on voluntary national commitments, self-reported progress, international pressure based largely on credibility and moral standing. What problem does this solve? Who appears responsible? Who retains moral legitimacy? What it does not solve is the most fundamental question. When economic conditions deteriorate, who pays for the public good? During periods of global growth and fiscal flexibility, this structure could function. Costs could be absorbed into expanding economies. But when growth slows and the economic pie stops expanding, public goods are naturally squeezed out of budgets. This is not moral failure. It is how public finance works. Part 3. Why everything has changed. The world has entered a survival-first phase. To understand our current moment, focus on 3 forces. 1. Debt. When governments operate in perpetual debt rollover mode, they are no longer planning for the future, they are ensuring short-term stability. Someone living on borrowed money cannot afford idealism. Neither can a state. 2. Energy. Energy has shifted from a market commodity back into a strategic asset. Strategic assets prioritize 3 things. Reliability. When energy security rises to the top, carbon reduction inevitably moves down. 3. War and geopolitical conflict. War may not be constant, but preparation for war is. And budgets are zero-sum. As defense, energy, and debt servicing dominate fiscal space, long-term public goods are systematically compressed. This is where the central judgment becomes unavoidable, when the world prepares for war. Debt and recession, climate idealism yields to survival reality. Part 4. What did Trump change? Not the cause, but the signal. Many people attribute today's shift to individual political figures. That misses the deeper point. The decisive factor is not personality, but structure. Trump's significance lies in making one priority explicit. When climate commitments conflict with national competition takes precedence. As the world moves from cooperative globalization to competitive restructuring, climate policy becomes embedded in industrial strategy and national security. Agreements do not disappear. They lose weight. Documents remain. Conferences continue. But direction is decided by supply chains and energy security. Part 5. The counterintuitive truth. Carbon reduction. It's not disappeared, it has changed form. If you only look at voter backlash and carbon tax debates, it may appear that carbon reduction has ended. But if you follow capital flows, industrial policy, and supply chains, a different picture emerges. Carbon reduction has not vanished. It is shifting from mass-based reduction to industry-driven reduction. The old model imposed visible costs on individuals, higher electricity prices, higher fuel costs, direct taxation. The new model operates through subsidies, tariffs, industrial policy, infrastructure restructuring. The costs remain, but they are embedded, indirect, spread across fiscal systems, inflation, and long-term taxation. The real shift is this. Carbon reduction will continue, but the way societies pay for it will fundamentally change. Part 6. The Canadian Perspective. For mid-sized economies like Canada, this transition is especially painful. Costs are borne domestically, while control over core supply chains remains limited. This creates a persistent tension. The cost of public goods is local, but the benefits are often external. That is why carbon policy has become increasingly difficult to sustain politically. Not because people stopped caring about the future, but because survival pressures have moved forward in line. Conclusion. A conclusion forced by logic, not opinion. We can now connect all the threads. Time pathways have been exhausted. Political institutions cannot sustain high-intensity public goods indefinitely. Debt, energy, and security have reordered global priorities. Under these constraints, the original model of global carbon reduction is no longer executable in most countries. This is not because humanity has become short-sighted or because climate risk disappeared. It is because the world has entered a colder phase. When the world prepares for war, debt, and recession, climate idealism gives way to survival reality. This is not a betrayal of ideals. It is reality reprioritizing ideals. So the next time we hear grand climate commitments, perhaps the most important question is not what is promised, but what can still be delivered under today's constraints. This is OntarioSummer. If you're more interested in how long-term changes shape everyday choices rather than daily emotional headlines, this channel will keep focusing on exactly that. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.